Hi, I'm Richard Skinner. Welcome to Campaigns and Elections. Today we're going to do an overview of the basic elements of the American Electoral System and how they shape how campaigns are run, who decides to seek office, and how other actors respond to that. So this class is about how Americans choose elected officials. It also involves how candidates pursue office, how they win party nominations, how they communicate with citizens, how they develop campaign strategy, how they fund their campaigns. The class also involves the roles played by other actors in campaigns: political consultants, the mass media, interest groups, donors, party officials, and so on. Many of these groups may work together to elect candidates. Some of these entities, of course, have their own interests. The media wants viewers and readers. But journalists, of course, also want to tell a good story. They want to, on some level, report the news. Political consultants want their party to win. They want to work for winning campaigns. They want to advance their careers. They want to make more money. They have all these different goals. So campaigns are shaped by the rules that govern elections. The qualifications that are necessary for candidates, the timing of elections, the size and characteristics of constituencies. The most obvious difference in sizes of constituencies in American politics are the differences in the size of American states. You have California with 36 million or so people. You have place like Wyoming with 500,000. Radical difference, of course. Both states have 2 senators. Fundraising, the eligibility of people to vote, the terms under which it's determined that someone has won an election, the technologies that are used for voting, and so on. These rules cannot be changed easily. They shape who runs for office and how they campaign. Campaigns are also shaped by the reality of political life. They're shaped by the reality of the candidates' lives. Here you see a picture of John McCain, who in this picture, it's 1973, and he has returned from captivity in North Vietnam. Obviously, McCain has based much of his political career on his own personal biography. Here we also see Ronald Reagan, before he was elected to office, but by which point he was already a prominent conservative commentator. In this case, he actually recorded a phonograph album denouncing socialized medicine, which is to say, Medicare. McCain, for his entire career, has talked about his military background. Ronald Reagan, for his entire political career, had a certain credibility as a spokesman for conservative causes. He also was somebody who liberals despised. He had a fairly clear-cut ideological profile. Campaigns are shaped by parties. As we'll talk about throughout this class, virtually the only way to win office, in most cases in American political life, is through one of the 2 major parties. These political parties have traditional values that they emphasize. If you're a Democrat, you spend a lot more time talking about equality and diversity and community and values like that. If you're a Republican, you spend a lot more time talking about freedom, order, national pride. All these things tend to be things that Republicans tend to care about. You have a vision of morality that tends to emphasize traditional rules and tends to emphasize individual responsibility as opposed to more communal responsibility. Political parties have long-standing coalitions. For decades, virtually all African Americans have supported the Democratic Party. On the other side, for the past generation or so, the great bulk of white evangelical Protestants have supported the Republican Party. Uh, if you're going to win the nomination of either of those parties, it's going to be important to win over the support of those groups. It's also going to be important that you get them out to vote for you in the general election. On the other hand, it's going to rule certain people out of winning a party nomination. If you're a Republican, you really have to oppose abortion rights, you have to oppose same-sex marriage, you have to oppose legalizing drugs, and so on, because these are all causes that are important to evangelical voters. Political parties also have records in office. Whoever the Democratic nominee is in 2016 is going to some degree, defend the record of Barack Obama in office. That means defending the Affordable Care Act. That will mean defending action against climate change. It will mean defending the nuclear arms agreement with Iran, and so on. The Republican will surely attack that record. But on some level will be responsible for the records of Republican administrations in the past. You'll inevitably get questions about, do you think that George W. Bush made the right decision by going to war in Iraq? Parties, elections are also affected by events. The most obvious is the state of the economy. Probably the strongest predictor of the outcome of presidential elections. I think, if you're a Democrat, you want an economy that is growing more rapidly with unemployment falling. If you're a Republican, you maybe don't want that. War can be an important event shaping campaigns. We've seen with 3 presidents over the past 60 years, wars that became very, very unpopular. That was the case with Iraq under George W. Bush. That was the case with Vietnam under Lyndon Johnson. And that was the case of Korea under Harry Truman. And these were all huge liabilities for their political parties. Other foreign policy crises can have an effect. The attack of September 11, 2001 gave George W. Bush a big boost in popularity, which was enormously helpful for Republican candidates in the 2002 elections. Right now, Obama is probably being hurt somewhat by the prominence of ISIS in the Middle East. One thing that's worth noting about this is that a lot of this is out of the control of presidents and other office holders, whether they be members of Congress or governors or mayors. There is fairly little they can do to shape the course of the economy. That is especially true if you are in subnational office. If you're a mayor or a governor, you really are sometimes at the mercy of events. Events around the world are obviously out of their control. There's not much that Barack Obama can do about the condition of the economy in China right now. Campaigns are also shaped by the strategy employed by candidates. They can include the decision to run in the first place, which issues to emphasize, which messages and themes to use, which kinds of media to use, how to organize their campaigns, and so on. In the end, campaign effects are usually at the margins. As I mentioned, many of the things that shape the outcome of an election are out of the control of a campaign. But certainly many elections are close, and campaigns can, of course, have a pretty significant effect. Campaign organizations, political parties, and interest groups usually work together to elect candidates. So in 2016, you can expect the Republican nominee to work closely with Republican organizations at all levels. Worked with interest groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or the National Rifle Association or the National Right to Life Committee, all of whom are going to be interested in electing a Republican president. The media, of course, also plays a crucial role in campaigns. It's the main way that citizens receive information. Of course, as we'll talk quite a bit about in this class, citizens are not blank slates, and they're going to interpret information from the media in different ways. Democrats and Republicans will interpret the same news story very differently. That's the same for men and women, African Americans, Hispanics, white people. All will react differently to new information. Citizens have to make their own decisions. Will they vote at all? Many will not. Indeed, if you look particularly at non-presidential elections, most Americans will not vote. How will they vote? For which candidate, for which political party? And they're guided by their predispositions. Most important is political party. Party identification is the single strongest predictor of how people will vote. Also by ideology, which these days is pretty closely tied to political parties. But you will see differences in the behavior of self-identified liberal Democrats and self-identified moderate Democrats, for example. Race, religion, gender, all these are predispositions that will affect how citizens react to the events of a campaign. Citizens also vary extensively in the level of political interest, in the level of information that they have. There are massive differences in the electorate between people who are very well informed and people who are not informed. And if anything, those differences are widening over time. These predispositions will shape how they process information, whether they decide to participate in politics, and how they decide to vote. People always have complaints about campaigns. They're too long, they're too expensive, they're too negative. The problem, of course, is that almost all of these are aspects of campaigns that are difficult to change in our system. For example, many countries limit campaigns by restricting or forbidding television advertising, or restricting the length of campaigns. That is unconstitutional in this country. That is barred by the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech. People complain about the negativity of campaigns, and yet if you look at negative ads, they actually tend to include more information than do positive ads. They actually teach people more than do positive ads. Campaign reform is not simple. There are competing values. One value is that citizens need to be free to choose. They need to be free of coercion. They need to have adequate information to make their decisions. But of course, our system rarely leaves up to it. While overt coercion is rare, there are certainly situations in which people may feel social pressure to vote a particular way. You may not be want to be the one in your local country club who's a big fan of Bernie Sanders for president. But more often it's a matter of voters not being well informed, of voters not being able to make decisions that many people would be considered intelligent because they simply don't know enough. They don't know enough about the issues. They don't know enough about the candidates. They don't know enough about the conditions in the country. And indeed, even if you look at some of the best informed voters, these same voters are oftentimes strongly partisan, and they may well be actively misinformed about the other side. Certainly, one stimulus to political activism can be thinking that the people on the other side are a lot worse than they are. Campaigns also oftentimes feature incumbents that either don't have a challenger or don't have a serious challenger. A challenger who cannot run television advertisements, a challenger who's not able to reach out to the public. And so there really isn't any real debate. Another value is political equality. Citizens need to have an equal say in who wins office. But there are many barriers to voting, most notably voter registration, going to the polling place on election day, learning about the issues, learning about the campaign. For many citizens, these are difficult. If you are not well educated, if you have a job where you don't usually read complex material, many things about our political process may seem to be intimidating. If you are quite low income, it may be difficult for you to be politically active. You may be more focused on survival. You may not be able to go to that political meeting because you can't afford to hire a babysitter to watch over your child. Not only do voters have very different resources, but candidates have very different resources. Most obviously, some candidates either have their own wealth or they have the access to other people's wealth to fund their campaigns. But there are other resources that vary between candidates. Name identification. If you're Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, you are much better known to the public than, say, Lindsey Graham or Bobby Jindal. Candidates vary in their ability to communicate. They vary in their ability to organize campaigns. They vary in their ability to speak in public. Now, if you're looking at, say, presidential candidates, by and large, most candidates will have those resources. But if you're looking at, say, local politics, you're going to find a lot more candidates or even potential candidates who face really significant barriers. And one outcome of all these differences is the views of the affluent and better educated are much better represented than those of other Americans. If you look at public policy, it tends to reflect the views of the better off. That's in part because that's who tends to run for office. That's because these are the people who tend to be politically active. These are the people who join political groups. These are the people who give to campaigns. These are the people who volunteer on campaigns. These are the people who feel comfortable contacting government officials. These are the people who tend to know more about what government is doing. All of these things add up to a very unequal political system. Citizens must have enough information to make intelligent decisions. This is the value of deliberation. And candidates must offer contrasting positions on relevant issues. But of course, voters are dependent upon the media to teach them about the candidates, and media coverage is oftentimes obsessed with strategy, scandal, personality. Oftentimes, aspects of the campaign that are very entertaining but don't necessarily tell people very much about what they need to know in order to make an intelligent decision. If you get campaign rhetoric, it rarely meets the lofty requirements of democratic theory. It's, of course, quite common for candidates to misrepresent their opponents, to engage in exaggerated or deceptive rhetoric, to be vague about their views on some issues. All these things are quite common. And so it's quite questionable whether campaign rhetoric meets the sorts of lofty requirements that Democratic theorists would stake out for it. Free speech. Citizens and candidates must be able to express their views freely without restraint. And the Supreme Court has long given political speech the highest possible protection. It treats political speech substantially different than, say, it treats commercial speech, where there are far more grounds under which to allow regulation. For example, the Supreme Court will allow a business to be prosecuted for fraud if it engages in deceptive advertising. On the other hand, the court has said governments cannot prosecute candidates who engage in deceptive advertising. However, there are conflicts between free speech and other values. Deliberations, they said much campaign speech is not necessarily enlightening. And political equality. There you see a huge conflict because the Supreme Court has said that equality can never justify restrictions on political speech, and it has interpreted that to mean that you can never restrict the amount of money spent on campaigns, because restricting the amount of campaign spending is a direct limitation on the quantity of political speech. Who can run? The Constitution sets minimum ages for 3 offices, for the President, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. These are generally not onerous restrictions. There aren't that many people who are significantly younger than these ages who would be plausible candidates for these offices. Here you see 3 recent presidents, John F. Kennedy, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, who were all in their 40s when they were elected to president. And they were all, at the time, noted as particularly young candidates. And they received both positive and negative coverage for that. There was a lot of excitement about these 3 men, that they were young, that they were vigorous, that they were exciting. On the other hand, they were also, all 3 of them, portrayed as inexperienced, perhaps immature, undisciplined. There are, of course, sort of informal age requirements for these offices, in that there are traditionally some sense that you couldn't be older than a certain age to run for president, but I think that age has steadily risen. That Dwight Eisenhower, when he ran for president at 62, was seen as an old man. When Ronald Reagan ran for president at 69, he was seen as old. Now I think the idea of a presidential candidate in his or her 70s is not that disconcerting to most people, now that people are living longer lives and are in better health later in life. Offices are generally limited to U.S. citizens. Only natural-born citizens can become president. This means people born in this country can run for president. It also means people who were born to American citizens outside this country are eligible for president. So, for example, John McCain was actually born outside the United States, but his parents were both U.S. citizens, and he was seen as constitutionally eligible. There are also residency requirements. There are requirements for the President, Senate, and House for the length of time for which they have to have been resident in the United States. And states have a variety of restrictions on how long people have to have lived there before they run for office. There are particular values underlying these requirements. Competence underlies age, the notion that you have to have had a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of maturity. Uh, Loyalty could be said to underlie residency. There certainly are many candidates who may not have lived in their constituency for very long, who've been accused of not necessarily having real ties to the constituency. And then familiarity with that constituency also underlies that residency requirement. And more than one candidate for office has found herself or himself mocked for not being that familiar with the state or district in which they're running. Almost all elected officials belong to the Democratic or Republican parties. Independents and minor party candidates find it difficult to get on the ballot, let alone win office. This means that ambitious politicians pursue careers in the major parties. As a result, minor party candidates are oftentimes eccentric or extremists. These are the people oftentimes who run when there's no realistic possibility of winning. And here we see two people who have run for president in recent years, Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders. Ron Paul, of course, is a libertarian. He was the Libertarian Party nominee for president in 1988. But when he ran for Congress, he served in Congress at two different times. He ran as a Republican, was elected as a Republican, and then he ran for president twice as a Republican in 2008 and 2012. And I think it's fair to say that his candidacy both times as a Republican attracted a lot more attention than being the Libertarian nominee. And we see here Bernie Sanders, who's had an interesting political career. He basically came out of Vermont's equivalent of the Green Party. He's a self-proclaimed socialist and was elected to Congress as one of the very few independents to win office. But in Congress, he's essentially served as a Democrat. He gained seniority as a Democrat. He had support for the Democratic Party. And then when he ran for president in for the 2016 election, he decided to run as a Democrat. That he felt even if he probably has only a very long shot chance of being the Democratic nominee, he thought that was better than trying to run as a third party candidate, particularly given the example of Ralph Nader, who in 2000 received a pretty small amount of the vote, but also arguably was responsible for electing George W. Bush. There are term limits. In 1951, the 22nd Amendment limits presidents to 2 terms, or 10 years in office. Many governors and many state legislatures are term limited, but the Supreme Court has ruled that states cannot limit the terms of their members of Congress. Only Congress can do that, or potentially a constitutional amendment. The debate over term limits reflects two different concepts of representation. Advocates of term limits tend to support the delegate model. In this model, public officials should represent the wishes of their constituents, representatives should be as close to the people as possible, and representation is simply a convenience because it is impossible to have all the people vote on legislation. You don't particularly want representatives to exercise independent judgment. That they're there just simply to vote for their constituents and express their views. Opponents of term limits tend to support the trustee model. Representatives are chosen for their superior judgment and knowledge. They should think and argue about public issues. They should reflect the public's values on some level, but should act in their long-term interests. And they should feel free to disregard public opinion when necessary. I think it's safe to say that the delegate model and the trustee model both apply to American politics. They apply under different conditions. The trustee model applies more on issues that most voters don't know very much about, that most voters don't have real opinions about. That would be, of course, much of what government does, particularly in the area of economic policy and in foreign policy, and most voters just don't know enough to have real opinions. On the other hand, it's also clear that sometimes the delegate model applies, that representatives do tend to reflect the views of their constituents, at least the constituents who belong to their party. Most representatives would think it is entirely appropriate for them to represent the economic interests of their constituents. That if they don't look out for the 17th District of Illinois, nobody else will. These rules rarely seriously constrain candidates. Few potential candidates are too young to run, and in the end, of course, they will hopefully get older and pass those ages and become eligible to run. Relatively few people who are not U.S. citizens would run for office if they were eligible. The only one of these requirements that is a serious issue in terms of who runs for office is the requirement that presidents be a natural born citizen. And there, every now and then, there is somebody who would be a potential presidential candidate who cannot run because he or she was not born in the United States. And here we see two examples from recent years. You have Arnold Schwarzenegger, who of course was governor of California, who was born in Austria. There were people at the time when he was governor who proposed amend for Arnold, that they should amend the Constitution to get rid of the natural born requirement, specifically so Arnold Schwarzenegger could run for president. In the end, that didn't happen, and for other reasons, it's doubtful that Arnold Schwarzenegger will ever hold political office again. And Jennifer Granholm, governor of Michigan, fairly prominent in the Democratic Party, was born in Canada. And so she too is ineligible to run for president. The residency of a candidate is sometimes a political issue. Sometimes candidates are criticized or mocked for not really living in the state or district where they're running. Senator Richard Lugar was defeated in a 2012 primary, in part because he no longer owned a home in his state, and he no longer even went into the pretense of really living in Indiana. Scott Brown, of course, served briefly as a senator from Massachusetts. He was defeated in 2012. He then decided to move to New Hampshire and immediately announced that he was running for Senate there. And he, too, was mocked for doing that, and in the end was defeated, I think, in large part because of public resentment of his move. On the other hand, in 2000, Hillary Rodham Clinton ran for the Senate in New York State despite never having lived there. She just bought a home and then ran for Senate, and she won. So it's maybe not an ironclad rule that you have to have deep roots in a state before you run. Party affiliation clearly disqualifies some candidates who are not involved in one of the two major parties. Fortunately for them, the Democrats and Republicans are pretty permeable. It is not hard to establish credentials in those parties, and you certainly have had a number of people who've switched parties over the years. And term limits, of course, obviously disqualifies some people. I don't know if Barack Obama would want a third term. I don't know if Barack Obama would win a third term. But he can't have a third term. Constitution sets the timing of elections for federal office. Uh, Members of the House of Representatives serve for 2 years. Senators serve for 6. Presidents serve for 4. The general election date is set by federal law. States usually use the same election date year after year, as does the federal as applies to federal elections. States, however, do vary in the year in which they elect governors. You have some states, like West Virginia, that elect their governors in the same year that they elect a president. Most commonly, you have states like Maryland that elect their governors in the off year, so that they had elections in 2010 and 2014 and 2018. And then a few other states will elect their governors in an off year. Most notably, Virginia elects its governors in the year after a presidential election, so 2009, 2013, 2017. Local elections are often held on other dates. They are not necessarily held on the same dates as state and national elections. And the most most notably, a number of cities elect mayors and other officials at odd times of the year. That's one reason why voter turnout tends to be lower in local elections than they are in state and national elections. So here we have Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago, who was reelected as mayor this April. So in a completely different time of year from when other elections are held, and inevitably you have far fewer people voting. Most states have primary elections that choose the nominees of political parties. States usually have much leeway when they will schedule those during the year. You have some states that have them relatively early, such as in April and May. You have some that have them relatively late in September. On the other hand, if you look at most other democracies have parliamentary systems in which the national legislature, such as the House of Commons in Great Britain, chooses the head of government, in this case the Prime Minister. And Prime Ministers can call elections at any time, and inevitably they use this to advantage their political party. So in 1983, Great Britain won a great victory in the Falklands War. Margaret Thatcher called elections immediately following the war, at a time when she and the Conservative Party were very popular, and they won by an enormous margin. In 1990, the government of West Germany had elections immediately following the reunification of Germany, so the first elections of a reunified Germany, and the ruling party won by a large margin because there was all this national excitement about the unification of Germany. American elections tend to encourage advanced planning and long campaigns. You see this most dramatically in the presidential race, where you've had people who basically been running for a year or two before any votes are actually cast. But you see this in Congress, where some members are essentially always running for re-election. You see this throughout our political system. This is known as the permanent campaign. And this includes a number of aspects. Fundraising, particularly members of Congress oftentimes report that they spend more time raising money for the re-election than they do almost anything else. travel, such as a member of Congress constantly traveling back to his or her constituency, or for that matter, a president traveling around the country to visit states that are seen as critical for the next election, engaging in constituent service to help one's popularity back home, and outreach to the local and national media, which of course is another way to gain popularity. Where can people run? Most elections in our system are conducted through single member constituencies. There can only be one winner. And this system tends to favor a two-party system for reasons that we will discuss later in the class. But, of course, you have presidents that are elected not really nationwide. They're elected, of course, by elections in each state for presidential electors. You have senators and governors and other officials elected by state. But on the other hand, seats in the House of Representatives are apportioned by the population, and they are changed every 10 years with a new census. And after the census, it becomes clear which states have had population that has grown faster than others. So here we see a map from the most recent census, and the blue states are ones that have gained seats. So you see Texas, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, all gaining seats. And you see the states in orange losing seats. So New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, all losing seats. This reflects a pattern that has prevailed for the past several decades of population shifting away from the Northeast and Midwest and moving to the South and West. Districts also have to be redrawn every 10 years for both Congress and the state legislatures in order to ensure that these districts all have equal population. The redistricting process is usually done by state legislatures and governors, but some states use independent commissions, usually the idea that they will make this process less political, which isn't always the case. For many decades, congressional and state legislative districts were oftentimes grossly unequal in size. This is known as malapportionment, and it tended to mean that rural areas were highly overrepresented in Congress and especially in the state legislatures. This led to cracks about one cow, one vote. That you would have districts that might not be changed for many years, so they weren't altered to reflect the movement of population from rural areas to urban areas, or sometimes they were just drawn in ways that made them very unequal in their size. There was no requirement that states redraw their districts every 10 years. So you would have states that might be using the same congressional districts that were enacted 30 or 40 years before. And this had real outcomes, that state legislatures particularly tended to reflect rural interests, which tend to mean more conservative political views. However, in a series of cases in the 1960s, the Supreme Court establishes the principle of one person, one vote, that everyone's vote had to count equally, no matter where they lived. And they ruled that unequal redistricting violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, that states cannot deny to their citizens the equal protection of the laws. This led to a revolution in redistricting. The widespread redrawing of district lines, regular redrawing of district lines after every census. The Supreme Court imposed a strict standard for population equivalence. This is probably the single point on which they are most adamant, that districts for the House of Representatives and for the state legislatures have to be of equal size and is equal population. And the result of this was you ended up with particularly state legislatures that were far more representative of public opinion and which were far less dominated by rural interests. Another issue regarding redistricting is the treatment of racial minorities. District lines were long drawn to reduce the power of racial minorities, that African American neighborhoods might be cut in two, they might be drawn in ways that would make it very unlikely that a member of a racial minority would ever be elected to office. And in 1961, the Supreme Court for the first time declared that political boundaries could unconstitutionally disadvantage minorities. In this case, it involved the city of Tuskegee, Alabama, which many of you may know is the home to a traditionally African American college. By the 1950s, more and more African Americans in that community were registering to vote. It was a community where African Americans greatly outnumbered whites, and the white authorities decided that the way they would maintain their hold on power is by redrawing the boundaries of the city of Tuskegee in a particularly absurd fashion as to exclude essentially all African American residents. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, maybe our most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever. And the Voting Rights Act forbade, among other things, forbade states from diluting the voting power of minorities through election rules. And this led to many states having their legislative maps challenged in the courts, and oftentimes states were ordered to redraw their district lines and in such a way as to allow more members of racial minorities to be elected for office. Recently, we saw the death of longtime Congressman Louis Stokes from Cleveland, Ohio, and he was someone who actually brought a suit that led to the creation of the congressional district that then sent him to the House. Basically, he managed to get the Supreme Court to order the state of Ohio to draw a district in Cleveland that would have a black majority. The Voting Rights Act also established preclearance. That is, election rules in jurisdictions that either had a history of discrimination or had a history of very low voter turnout had to gain prior approval from the Justice Department for any changes to their election rules. However, 2 years ago, the Supreme Court declared that the formula used by the government to determine eligibility for preclearance was obsolete. And so far, Congress has not been able to come up with another formula. The Voting Rights Act has been amended repeatedly. In 1982, it was amended to declare that even unintentional discrimination could be illegal. 4 years later, in the case of Thornburg versus Gingles, which involved the state legislative districting of North Carolina. The Supreme Court ruled that yes, district lines could discriminate. It established a criteria for the finding of discrimination. And under this standard, it could order the drawing of more racially representative districts if there's a sufficiently large and geographically concentrated group that could comprise a majority in the district. And this group was politically cohesive, and there was a history of polarized voting. Gerrymandering is the drawing of district lines for political advantage. The term was coined to describe a map drawn by Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry in 1812. Here we see the cartoon that led to the creation of this term, gerrymander. The cartoonist looked at the pattern of a district in Massachusetts and thought that it looked quite a bit like a salamander. So drew a cartoon in which the district is indeed a salamander. Obviously, this person was not a fan of Gary's plan. And so that's how we get the term gerrymander. Gerrymandering can serve multiple purposes. It can favor racial minorities, can create majority and minority districts. It can serve to protect incumbents, or it can serve the purposes of one political party. The political party that is able to draw the lines may decide to break up strongholds of the other party so that voters in those areas are outvoted by others. Or it can decide to concentrate voters supporting the other party in one district so that the surrounding districts will then favor the other party. Computer technology has made redistricting easier, less labor intensive. It also has allowed for outsiders, people outside of government, to offer their own plans. So it's not unusual now at the time of redistricting, for outside groups to offer their own plans that they figure will advantage their supporters. Redistricting faces multiple criteria. We already mentioned the Voting Rights Act and the protection of racial minorities, the need for equal population, but there's usually a concern with compactness, that districts not be too unwieldy, that they respect communities of interest. These are lines such as the boundaries of cities and the boundaries of counties, that as much as possible you want to keep those constituencies within the same district. The Supreme Court has rarely interfered with gerrymandering. It, by and large, tends to think this is a political issue. It has accepted plans drawn for partisan advantage or to protect incumbents. Said, there are interests, there are legitimate government interests that support these lines. It has, however, been willing to rule on racial gerrymandering. And it's done that in essentially two different directions. On the one hand, it has ruled that district lines cannot discriminate against a minority. And this has led to the creation of more minority-majority districts. After Thornburg versus Gingles, the Reagan and George H.W. Bush Justice Departments encouraged the creation of minority-majority districts. And you would wonder why that would be the case. These were both administrations that tended to oppose racial classification. These were both administrations that got relatively little support from African Americans and Hispanics. But there was a sound political strategy behind this. That the creation of minority-majority districts while it led to a large increase in the number of minority members of Congress, also favored Republicans, since the remaining districts were more heavily white. So that if you created a district that was, say, 70% African American, the surrounding districts would probably then have relatively few black residents. You'd have districts that might be 80 or 90% white, and these would be good for Republicans. This was very bad for white Southern Democrats, since many of them had depended upon minority votes. So that if you were a white Democratic district with 30 or 40% African American population, might be very good for you. But a district that was 70% African American would probably elect an African American representative, and one that was only 10 or 20% African American would probably elect a Republican. The Supreme Court looked into this matter in the 1990s in Shaw v. Reno and then Miller v. Johnson. And the Supreme Court ruled that race cannot be the predominant factor in the drawing of district lines. And this led to the redrawing of a number of minority districts. Most of the affected black representatives were still reelected. But the courts have been willing to accept race as one factor in redistricting, but not as the main factor. So, for example, recently the Supreme Court threw out the congressional map in Virginia because they thought that it unconstitutionally concentrated African Americans into one district in the Richmond and Norfolk areas. So now Virginia is facing the contentious matter of redrawing its congressional districts. How can redistricting affect a candidate's strategy? It can encourage or discourage candidates. A candidate may see lines as friendly or unfriendly. Certainly there are sometimes incumbents who decide not to run after they receive district lines that are unfavorable. It can limit competitiveness by favoring one party or the other. It can favor or disfavor incumbents. Can also make representation more representative with more racial minorities. One can argue that strongly partisan districts can favor representatives simply because citizens are more likely to approve of their representatives when that representative is of the same political party. So you have a district that is 70% Republican and always elects a Republican. That means probably 70% of the people in the district are going to be pretty happy. By contrast, a competitive district, one that is, say, 51-49, that will mean that most of the time about half the voters are pretty unhappy. So that's an argument in favor of partisan districting. The effects of gerrymandering on moles are probably less than is often argued. It doesn't necessarily always advantage incumbents. It doesn't necessarily reduce competitiveness. Doesn't necessarily exacerbate political polarization. And there are a whole list of studies that have looked into this. And while many people could rightly criticize gerrymandering on a whole range of grounds, it's probably not as big of a deal as it's oftentimes portrayed as being. So who can vote? The Constitution mostly allowed the states to define the qualifications for voting. Most states imposed property qualifications for voting, that you had to own a certain amount of property in order to vote. But by the 1820s and 1830s, those limits were mostly abolished. This led, of course, to a much wider and more representative electorate, but then one was still entirely white and male. Most states forbade African Americans from voting. This included even many states in the North that did not have slavery. However, after the Civil War, Congress passed the 15th Amendment that forbade the states from denying the right to vote based on race. This was enforced briefly during the period of Reconstruction when the Union Army was occupying much of the South. However, at the end of Reconstruction in 1877, white Southerners began employing a variety of tools to prevent black voting. These included poll taxes. You would actually have to pay a tax in order to vote. Literacy tests. You'd have to prove that one was literate. Onerous registration requirements. Say that you had to register a year in advance of an election. Economic coercion. If one tried to vote, one might lose a job, have one's loans called in, be evicted from their home. And of course, violence. It was one of the main things that led to lynchings. All of these, of course, were used most often against African Americans, but they were sometimes also used to restrict voting by poor whites. If these laws had been enforced fairly, they still would have been an enormous burden on African American voting, simply because so many African Americans were desperately poor and could not afford to pay a poll tax. And of course, before the Civil War, it was actually illegal in most southern states to teach slaves to read. So you had a large number of African Americans who had no formal education. But of course, these laws were never enforced fairly. They were always enforced in such a way as to disenfranchise African Americans. The effort to restrict black voting increased in the 1890s and was very effective. Voter turnout was cut in half. Almost all African Americans and many poor whites lost the access to the ballot. The Republican Party in the South, which in those days was very dependent upon African American voting, essentially disappeared. And politics in the South was strictly white and democratic for many decades. One of the ways in which African American voting was prevented was by having the Democratic Party declare itself to be a private club that refused to admit any black members. This is the so-called white primary. In those days, the Democratic Party was absolutely dominant throughout the South. There was no party competition. The primary chose the real winner of the election. In the 1940s, however, the Supreme Court ruled the white primary to be unconstitutional, and they ruled that political parties were not private clubs, and they could not simply decide to exclude people on the basis of race. As a result, black registration increased significantly in the following years, but was still quite lower than white registration, and particularly African Americans were unlikely to be registered to vote in the Deep South. One restriction on voting that was overturned was the poll tax. In 1964, you have the passage of the 24th Amendment, which abolished poll taxes in federal elections. 2 years later, the Supreme Court ruled that poll taxes were unconstitutional in state elections. However, Congress repeatedly passed civil rights legislation that was in part aimed at preventing discrimination against African Americans in voting. But these laws turned out to have limited effectiveness, in part because they usually depended upon people filing private lawsuits. In 1965, you have, of course, the Selma to Montgomery March that was met by ferocious violence by the Alabama State Police. This helped raise the salience of the issue of voting rights and helped Lyndon Johnson pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. which was meant to finally enforce the 15th Amendment 95 years after it had been passed. Voting Rights Act restricted the use of literacy tests, imposed criminal penalties for keeping qualified persons from voting. But most importantly, it declared that the federal government could take over the administration of elections if there was a continued pattern of discrimination. And in the end, the Voting Rights Act was enormously effective. And within a few years, blacks were voting throughout the South. And by the 1980s, black and white turnout had basically equalized throughout the South. Later amendments to the Voting Rights Act banned literacy tests, covered other ethnic minorities such as Hispanics and Native Americans, and required bilingual ballots in some areas. In 1869, Wyoming Territory became the first constituency to allow women to vote. New Jersey had at one point allowed some women to vote, basically because of an oversight. But it wasn't really until the early 20th century that women's suffrage became a major national cause, closely aligned with the reform movements of the Progressive era. There was a lot of overlap between support for women's suffrage and support for prohibition of alcohol. For a variety of reasons that you can imagine, women tended to be more supportive of prohibition. Women were seen as being likely to clean up politics. They were less likely to be corrupt. And between 1910 and 1918, 11 states voted to allow women to vote. And this movement gained momentum during World War I, in part because it gained the support of President Woodrow Wilson, in part because women were seen as contributing to the war effort. And in 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, which established a woman's right to vote on a national basis, and was ratified the next year. It did take many decades for women's turnout to catch up with men's, although since about 1980, women have actually voted at slightly higher rates than men. Congress acted at the end of the 1960s to set a national voting age of 18. Most states previously had the minimum age of 21. This was in part seen as a way to get the unruly youth of the time to take their discontent into the polling booth rather than onto the streets. However, the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional, that Congress could not impose an age for state elections, rather than have an unwieldy situation with different rules for state and national elections. A constitutional amendment was passed lowering the national voting age to 18. So who still cannot vote? Non-citizens, most notably. In 2012, about 7% of those living in the United States were non-American citizens. In New York City, about 1 in 5 people are not citizens of the United States. This requirement that only citizens can vote particularly reduces the political power of Hispanics and Asians, since both groups include many recent immigrants. People under 18 years of age, also overrepresented among racial minorities. Most prisoners, many felons, some mentally ill individuals. States vary greatly in these rules. And it's particularly controversial because prisoners and disqualified felons are much more likely to be low income and be from minority groups. Particularly, of course, these groups are much more likely to vote Democratic. All these groups of people who are disqualified have increased substantially over the past few decades. So this is becoming more and more important issue. Since the early 20th century, most party nominations have been chosen through primaries. These are elections held by the states. Closed primaries only allow registered party members to vote. It's only registered Democrats, registered Republicans. Semi-closed primaries are open to registered party members and to independents, but not members of the other party. So in that case, say a Republican primary would be open to registered Republicans and to independents, but not to Democrats. Open primaries are open to anyone. Anyone can vote in either party's primary. Blanket primaries are select the top. Blanket primaries include candidates of all parties, and then they select the top two finishers who will then compete in the general election. It is possible that both candidates will be of the same party. This has been recently adopted in both California and Washington State. In the early 20th century, most states adopted voter registration, that you had to, in advance of the election, file paperwork allowing you to vote. You had to be part of a master list of registered voters. This reduced voter fraud and vote buying. It became less possible for people to, say, vote multiple times. But it also decreased voting by immigrants and the less educated. Today, North Dakota is the only state that does not require voter registration. States vary greatly in their registration periods. 9 states have same-day registration, where you just show up at your polling place, you register, and then you vote. Voter registration is a major obstacle to voting, especially by less educated individuals who may find the process burdensome. Countries that have automatic registration, where people who are, if they are living in a constituency, are automatically considered eligible to vote, have higher rates of voter turnout than does the United States. Many countries also have compulsory voting. Citizens may be fined if they do not vote. These nations have higher rates of voter turnout. The United States elections are conducted in a highly decentralized process. The article describes it as multiple nested principal-agent relationships. A principal-agent relationship is when you have one person or one entity doing something on behalf of another person or entity. So, for example, if my wife has a shopping list and she gives it to me and I take it to the supermarket and I buy stuff she wants me to buy, she is the principal, I am the agent. In this case, you have one principal-agent relationship after another. States enjoy great freedom in how they conduct elections. Local officials actually manage most elections. Especially in smaller communities, elections are usually managed by officials with many other duties, county clerks, auditors, recorders, and so on. People may be responsible for managing all sorts of government documents. Election day activities are then performed by precinct poll workers, who usually are temporary employees only working for the day. This system poses serious questions of coordination. It is a complicated, messy system that is prone to messing up. Under the Constitution and federal law, Congress has extensive powers to regulate elections. This includes both provisions in the Constitution and subsequent laws such as the Voting Rights Act, the Help America Vote Act, laws governing voting by the military and by overseas civilians. The controversial 2000 election led to the passage of the Help America Vote Act. This created the Election Assistance Commission. The Election Assistance Commission is a fairly weak body. It serves as a national clearinghouse of information on voting equipment standards. It also provides resources to help states with new election standards under the Help America Vote Act. It serves as a vehicle to compile information and review procedures. It also distributes grant money to states and localities. But it has no power to make rules, to pass requirements. It can't make people do stuff. It is an advisory body only. And it was a weak organization that was fairly slow to get off the ground. States still dominate election law. There's wide variation in election administration, and this applies to voter technologies, to early voting, voter identification, voter registration, absentee voting, standards for a valid vote. One controversial aspect of this system is that in most states, the relevant officials are elected in a partisan process. Let's say a Secretary of State, who will usually conduct elections in that state, is usually elected as a Democrat or Republican. In turn, states then delegate election administration to the local and municipal levels, to counties and cities. There are more than 10,000 local jurisdictions that conduct elections in the United States. Most of these are quite small. Most Americans live in a fairly small number of jurisdictions. There are vast differences between these jurisdictions in the amount of money they have to spend, in the number of voters they have, the number of polling sites they have, the number of precinct workers. They're very, very different. And larger jurisdictions are more likely to be run by better educated, more professionalized officials. Most local election officials are elected. Partisanship affects implementation of election law. Republican election officials, for example, are more likely to purge felons from the ballot. Elected officials are associated with higher voter turnout. That is, you see higher voter turnout in areas where the election officials are actually elected by the people. They seem to be more interested in a customer service focus, more supportive of reforms, more interested in getting more people voting. Poll workers are the people actually on the ground who are enforcing the law. These are the ones who are running voting equipment, who are posting signs, who are handling ballots. Most of them are temporary. They're low paid. They tend to be older, tend more often to be college educated white women. There's widespread errors. Implementation varies greatly from place to place. And these are the people with whom voters are actually interacting. One of the most controversial aspects of the American election system in recent years has been voter identification laws. These have been adopted more and more over the past decade, usually supported by Republicans. They vary greatly in both the laws that create voter identification requirements and how those laws are actually implemented. And voter identification laws can discourage participation among the lower income, less educated. People who are less well off, less well educated, are less likely to have the sorts of voter identification that these laws require. Most nations have fairly consistent rules about election technology. The United States has far more elections than other countries. We elect a far greater number of offices. We elect many offices that are appointed elsewhere. In some countries, there may only be one meaningful election every few years. And there, those countries usually just use a paper ballot. The U.S. has great variation in voting technology between and within states. There's been a growing shift to the use of optical scan and electronic voting machines. These are now the most common forms of voting. And the Help America Vote Act helped phase out the use of lever machines and punch cards. And punch cards, of course, is what got Palm Beach County, Florida, in trouble. There are inevitable complications from absentee voting, voting for the disabled. Early voting has become much more common. It's become much easier to absentee vote than it was in the past. So all these things tend to increase the pressure on election officials. Not only, of course, now is the federal government reliant on states, and then states reliant on localities, and localities are reliant on poll workers, but now everyone is also reliant on the developers of voting technology. So here you have the most common forms of voting in the United States. Direct recording electronic machines, where you press a screen, and paper ballots with an optical scan, and lever machines and punch cards are mostly gone. Voting equipment that allows voters to know if they have made a mistake, that tells them if they have voted twice for an office or they have forgotten to vote for an office. That tends to lead to fewer errors. Electronic machines that let voters know if they have failed to vote for an office leads to fewer undervotes. Undervotes are when people do not vote for an office. Those that don't allow overvotes, not surprisingly, lead to fewer overvotes. Overvotes is when you vote for two candidates for an office for which you can only vote for one. So like in 2012, you had voted for both Obama and Romney for president. Under those circumstances, your ballot would be tossed out. There are also fewer ballot error problems when optical scan technology is programmed to let voters know if they've made a mistake. So there are a variety of aspects of voting technology that can make voter errors less common. Studies have found that people have less confidence in the process when people do not vote on election day. It doesn't seem to be affected by particular technologies, however. It is affected by interaction with poll workers and by the length of lines at polls. So people who say have to wait for a very long time in order to vote usually will be less confident in the process. So finally, the authors have two proposals. One is to create election day voting centers, essentially phase out the local polling place and replace them with a smaller number of polling locations, but which are located in high traffic areas where are easy for lots of people to get to, and allow people to vote anywhere in their jurisdiction, not just simply in their nearest location, not simply vote at their neighborhood school or neighborhood community center. And then have a registration database for the entire jurisdiction, say the entire legislative district or the entire city, the entire county, and that this would reduce the burden on staffing. You need fewer poll workers, and the poll workers might be more efficient. They also propose greater standardization and centralization, having more standard operating procedures that will reduce the discretion of those on the ground, reduce the discretion of poll workers and others. And most of these employees are inexperienced, poorly trained. If they have clear procedures to follow, they will make fewer errors. and then to centralize certain functions that they think it is most appropriate for the selection of voting equipment, less appropriate for site selection or recruiting poll workers. That in this case, you could have one form of voting that works well for an entire state, but say selecting voting sites or recruiting poll workers might be something that's better left at the local level. All right, well, thank you very much.